Church Peveril is a house so beset by spectres that none of the family members who dwell within its ancient walls take psychical phenomena with the slightest seriousness. To the Peverils, the appearance of ghosts is a matter of no more significance than the appearance of the postman to we who dwell in more ordinary houses. They arrive almost every day. They're often observed coming up the drive. They're forever knocking on the front door. I myself, when staying at the house, have seen the present Mrs. Peveril peer into the dusk after dinner and say to her daughter, "Blanche, dear, was that the blue lady that just went up and out into the shrubbery? I hope she won't upset Florence. Whistle for Florence, will you, dear?" Now, Florence, I should add, is the youngest and most beloved of many sausage dogs. "Oh, Florence won't mind, mother," said Blanche, and gave a cursory whistle. "But poor blue Aunt Barbara's such a bore, isn't she? Whenever I meet her, she always looks like she's desperate to tell me something, but when I ask her what's wrong, she just flaps a hand vaguely towards the stable block and moans. I think there was something she wanted to confess about 200 years ago, but she's forgotten what it is." And at this point, Florence gave 3 short, happy barks and capered out of the shrubbery, wagging her tail. "Oh, look," said Mrs. Peveril, "Florence has made friends with her. Oh, well done, Florrie. Good dog. Good for you." And then she added under her breath, "That really is a very stupid shade of blue she wears, poor woman. I can't think why she sticks with it." Now, from this, it may be gathered that even with regard to psychical phenomena, there is some truth in the proverb that speaks of familiarity. But no. The Peverils do not exactly treat their ghosts with contempt, since most of that delightful family never despised anybody except such people as did not care for hunting or golf. And as the domestic ghosts are all of their bloodline, it seems reasonable to suppose that each one, even the poor blue lady, excelled at some point in their lives at one outdoor sport or another. So no, they harbour no unkindness or contempt. Of one dead Peveril, in fact, they're exceptionally fond. Anthony, who in the mid-17th century broke his neck attempting to ride up the main staircase on a thoroughbred mare after committing some monstrous deed down by the lake. Blanche comes downstairs in the morning with an unusually bright eye when she can announce that Master Tony was very loud last night. He was a tremendous fellow across country, apparently, and they like these indications of his continued vitality. In fact, if you ever go and stay at Church Peveril yourselves, you should take it as a high compliment to be assigned a bedroom which is frequented by defunct members of the family. It means that you are considered worthy to look on the august and villainous dead. You'll find yourself shown into some chilly, candlelit tapestried chamber and told that great-great-grandmama Bridget occasionally has some vague business by the fireplace, but it's best not to talk to her. And after that, you'll be told that you'll hear Master Tony awfully well if he attempts the front staircase any time before morning. And then there you are left to your night's repose, or not, as the case may be. Now, for myself, I've managed to convince Mrs. Peveril that I have an obscure valvular disease of the heart. And so when I visit, I sleep undisturbed in the new wing of the house where Barbara, Bridget, and Tony never penetrate. Now, I forget the precise details of great-great-grandmama Bridget, but I'm pretty sure that she was the one who cut the throat of a chambermaid before disemboweling herself with an axe that had been used at Agincourt. But before that, she'd led a very full and sultry life. But there is one ghost at Church Peveril at which the family never laughs, in which they feel no friendly and amused interest, and of which they speak only as much as is necessary for the safety of their guests. More properly, perhaps, it should be described as 2 ghosts, for the haunt in question is that of 2 very young children, little more than babies, in fact, twins. And this pair, the family, take very seriously indeed. The story of them, as told to me by Mrs. Peveril, is as follows. In the year 1602, which was the last of Queen Elizabeth's reign, a certain Dick Peveril was greatly in favour at court. He was brother to Master Joseph Peveril, then owner of the family house and estates, who had 2 years previously, at the respectable age of 74, become father of twin boys, the firstborn of his progeny. Now, it is known that the royal and ancient Virgin Queen had once said to handsome Dick, who was nearly 40 years his brother's junior, "'Tis a pity, Dick, that you are not master of Church Peveril." And it is thought that these words might have prompted a sinister design to form in his mind. Be that as it may, very shortly afterwards, handsome Dick, who very adequately sustained the family reputation for wickedness, set off to ride down to Yorkshire and found, very conveniently, that his brother Joseph had just been seized with an apoplexy. This appeared to be the result of a continued spell of hot weather, combined with the necessity of Joseph quenching his thirst with an augmented amount of sack. He died while handsome Dick, with God knows what thoughts in his mind, was journeying northwards, and thus it came about that Dick arrived at Church Peveril just in time for his elderly brother's funeral. Well, he attended the obsequies with great propriety, and he returned to the house to spend a day or two of mourning with his sister-in-law. And it was on the second night of his stay that Dick did that which the Peverils still regret to this day. He entered the room where the twin infants slept with their nurse and quietly strangled the latter as she slept. Then he took the twins and put them into the fire which warms the long gallery. The weather, which up until the day of Joseph's death had been so hot, had suddenly changed to bitter cold, and the fire, heaped high with burning logs, was exultant with flame. In the core of this conflagration, Dick struck out a cremation chamber, into which he threw the two tiny children and stamped them down with his riding boots. They could just walk, but they could not walk out of that ardent place. It is said that Dick laughed as he added more logs, and thus he became the master of Church Peveril. Now, the crime was never brought home to him, although he lived no longer than a year in the enjoyment of his blood-stained inheritance. As he lay a-dying, Dick made confession to the priest who attended him that his spirit struggled forth from its fleshly coil before absolution could be given. And on that very night, there began in Church Peveril the haunting, which to this day is but seldom spoken of by the family, and then only in low tones and with serious mien. Only an hour after handsome Dick's death, one of the servants was passing the door of the long gallery when he heard within peals of that loud laughter, so jovial and yet so sinister, which he had thought would never be heard in the house again. In a moment of that cold courage which is so nearly akin to mortal terror, he opened the door and entered, expecting to see some fearful manifestation of him who lay dead in the room below. But no. Instead, he saw two little white-robed figures toddling hand in hand across the moonlit floor towards him. The watchers in the room below were startled by a sudden crash above them, and they rushed up to find the servant collapsed on the floor in the grip of some dread convulsion. Just before morning, he regained sufficient consciousness to tell his tale, and then, pointing with an ash-grey finger towards the door, he screamed aloud and fell back dead. Well, during the next 50 years, the strange and terrible legend of these twin babies became fixed and consolidated. Their appearance was fortunately exceedingly rare, and during these years they seem to have been seen only 4 or 5 times. On each occasion they appeared only at night, between sunset and sunrise, always in the same long gallery, and always as two toddling children, only just able to walk. And on each occasion, the luckless individual who saw them died speedily or terribly, or with both speed and terror, after the accursed vision had appeared to him. Sometimes he might live for a few months. If he was lucky, he died like the servant who first saw them within a few hours. Vastly more awful was the fate of a certain Mrs. Canning, who had the misfortune to see the twins in 1760. Now, By this time, the hours and the place of their appearance were well known, and visitors were always strictly warned not to go into the long gallery between sunset and sunrise. The brilliantly clever and beautiful Mrs. Canning, however, was an admirer and friend of the notorious sceptic Monsieur Voltaire, and she wilfully sat night after night in the haunted place, in spite of all protestations. For 4 evenings she saw nothing, but on the 5th, the door in the middle of the gallery opened, and there came, toddling towards her, the ill-omened little pair. Now, it seemed that even then, however, Mrs. Canning was undaunted, and she thought it good to mock at them, telling them that it was late for little ones and long past for them to get time for them to get back into the fire. In answer, they gave no word, but only turned away, sobbing, and disappeared. Now, Mrs. Canning rushed downstairs with the triumphant announcement that she had seen the spectral twins and must needs write to Monsieur Voltaire. Oh, it would make him laugh. When, however, the news reached Monsieur Voltaire some time later, he did not laugh at all. Mrs. Canning, you see, she was really an exceptionally good-looking woman, one of the great beauties of her day. And in 1760, she was at the zenith of her blossoming. Her chief attraction, if it's possible to single out one point where all was so exquisite, lay in the dazzling colour and incomparable brilliance of her complexion. I mean, she was 30 years of age, but in spite of the excesses of her life, she retained still the snow and roses of girlhood. And she courted the bright light of day, which other women shunned, for it but showed to great advantage the splendour of her skin. In consequence, she was considerably dismayed one morning, about a fortnight after her experience in the long gallery, to observe on her left cheek, an inch or two below her turquoise-coloured eyes, a little greyish patch of skin, about as big as a threepenny piece. Well, it was in vain that she applied her accustomed washes and unguents, vain too were the arts of her fardeuse and her medical adviser. For a week, Mrs. Canning kept herself secluded, martyring herself with solitude and unaccustomed physics, and for result, at the end of that week, she had no amelioration to comfort herself with. Instead, this woeful grey patch of skin had doubled in size. And thereafter, the nameless disease, whatever it was, developed in new and terrible ways. From the centre of the discoloured place, there sprouted forth little lichen-like tendrils of greenish grey, and another patch appeared on her lower lip. This too soon vegetated, and one morning, on opening her eyes to the horror of a new day, Mrs. Canning found that her vision was strangely blurred. She sprang to her looking-glass, and what she saw caused her to scream out loud. From under her upper eyelid, a fresh growth had sprung up, mushroom-like, in the night, and its filaments extended downward, screening the pupil of her eye. Soon afterwards, her tongue and her throat were attacked, the air passages became obstructed, and death by suffocation was generally agreed to have been a merciful release after such terrible suffering. Worse yet was the case of a certain Colonel Blantyre, who fired at the children with his revolver. No, I'm sorry, what he went through, I shall not even attempt to put into words for you tonight. This, then, it is the one haunting that the Peverills take seriously. And every guest, on his arrival in the house, is told that the long gallery must not be entered after nightfall on any pretext whatsoever. Now, by day, in fact, it's an absolutely delightful room, really, a truly comfortable and attractive place. It's fully 80 feet in length, lit by a row of 6 tall windows which overlook the gardens at the back. At one end, a large bow window looks straight down the avenue, while at the other, a door leads to the landing at the top of the main staircase. About halfway down is another door which communicates with the back staircase and the servants' quarters, and it was through this that the babies came when they appeared to Mrs. Canning. In fact, on several occasions, they've been known to make their entrance there, for the room out of which handsome Dick took them lies just beyond, at the top of the back stairs. Along the same wall, also facing the windows, is the fateful fireplace, and above this there hangs, with grim significance, a portrait of handsome Dick himself. Now, some claim that this is a Holbein, but I'm really not quite certain. During the day, though, as I say, the room it's a delightful spot, and quite the most popular room in the house. I mean, I've often lounged there myself on long August evenings until dressing time, but I've never been there when anyone has seemed disposed to linger without hearing the warning, "It's close on sunset, we'd better be moving." And sometimes it has happened that even while merriment was most uproarious, Mrs. Peveril has suddenly looked out of the window and said, "Yeah, it's getting rather late, my dears. Let's finish our nonsense downstairs in the hall." And then for a moment a curious hush falls on family and guests. And, as if some bad news had just been made known, we make our way silently out of the long gallery. Well, shortly after Christmas last year, a large, young, and peculiarly cheerful party was staying at Church Peveril. And as usual, on December the 31st, Mrs. Peveril was giving her annual New Year's Eve ball. Now, for some days, a black and windless frost had stopped all horse riding, but the lake below the house had, for the last 2 days, been covered with an admirable sheet of ice, and everyone in the house had been occupied that morning in performing swift and violent manoeuvres on the elusive surface. As soon as lunch was over, we all, with one exception, hurried out again. The exception was Madge Dalrymple. Now, poor Madge, you see, had the misfortune to fall rather badly earlier in the day, but she hoped that by resting her injured knee, instead of joining the skaters again, she would be able to dance that evening. Accordingly, after a rapid cup of coffee in the long gallery, we left her, comfortably reclined on the big sofa beside the fireplace, with an attractive book to beguile the tedium till tea. Now, being of the family, Madge, of course, knew all about handsome Dick and the babies, and the fate of Mrs. Canning, of course, even Colonel Blantyre. But still, as we went out, I heard Blanche say to her, "Don't run it too fine, dear." "Oh, don't worry, Blanche," she replied. "I'll be out well before sunset." And so we left her, alone, in the long gallery. Well, Madge read her attractive book for some minutes, but failing to get absorbed in it, she soon put it aside and limped across to the window. It was still but a little after 2 o'clock, but the crystalline brightness of the morning had given place to thick clouds, and it was a dim and uncertain light that entered the room now. The gloom and the bitter cold suggested the likelihood of heavy snowfall later on, and these outward signs were echoed inwardly in Madge by that muffled drowsiness of the brain, which, to those who are sensitive to the pressures and lightness of weather, portends storm. Now, Madge herself was peculiarly the prey of such influences. To her, a brisk morning gave an ineffable brightness and briskness of spirit, and correspondingly, the approach of heavy weather produced a somnolence that both drowsed and depressed her. It was in such a mood as this, then, that she limped back to the sofa beside the fire. She didn't open her book again. She simply lay on the sofa with her face towards the fireplace and idly watched the dwindling flames. She thought drowsily of going to her room and getting on with some neglected letters. And still drowsily, she began thinking over what she had to communicate. Well, one letter, several days overdue already, really should go to her mother, who was immensely interested in the psychical affairs of the family. Yeah, she could tell her how Master Tony had been prodigiously active on the staircase on Boxing Day, and how the Blue Lady, regardless of the freezing weather, had been seen that very morning strolling about near the fountain. Of the fatal twins, of course, nothing had been seen for many years past. But as her mother knew, the Peverils never used the long gallery after dark. And then for a moment, Madge sat up straight, remembering, that she was in the long gallery now. But I mean, it was still only a little after 2:30, and if she went to her room in half an hour, she'd have ample time to write this and another letter before tea. Till then, she'd read a book. Oh gosh, so she found that she'd left it on the windowsill, and it scarcely seemed worthwhile getting up for it. Oh, dear me, she really did feel extraordinarily drowsy. The sofa where she lay had lately been recovered in a greyish-green shade of velvet, somewhat the colour of lichen, thought Madge. It was very thick and soft, and she stretched her arms luxuriously on each side of her body and pressed her fingers into the nap. Ooh, how horrible that story of Mrs. Canning was. The growth on her face was the colour of lichen too, wasn't it? And then, without further transition or blurring of thought, Madge Dalrymple fell asleep. And Madge Dalrymple dreamed a dream. She dreamed that she awoke to find herself exactly where she'd gone to sleep and in exactly the same attitude. The flames from the logs had burned up again and now leapt on the walls, illuminating the picture of handsome Dick above the fireplace. Now, in her dream, Madge knew exactly what she had done earlier that day and why she was lying there now instead of being out on the ice with the rest of the skaters. And she remembered also, still dreaming, that she had to write a letter or two before tea, so she prepared to get up in order to go to her room. As she half rose, she caught sight of her arms lying on either side of her on the grey velvet sofa, but she could not see where her hands ended and where the grey velvet began. She could see her wrists quite clearly and a blue vein on the back of her hands, a knuckle here and there, but her fingers seemed to have melted into the fabric. And then she remembered her last thought before she fell asleep, Mrs. Canning, and the lichen-coloured vegetation that had assailed her face and eyes and throat, and at that, the strangling terror of nightmare began. Madge found herself absolutely unable to move, and she suddenly knew that she was being transformed into this grey stuff. She knew that soon the greyness would spread up her arms, through her body, over her head, and that in but a few minutes it would quite consume her, and that when her friends came in from skating, they would find nothing but a huge misshapen cushion of lichen-coloured velvet, whose name was Madge. The horror grew upon her until by a violent effort she shook herself free of the evil dream and awoke. For a minute or two, she simply lay there gasping, conscious only of the tremendous relief at finding herself awake. She felt again the pleasant touch of the velvet and drew her fingers backwards and forwards along it, reassuring herself that she was not, after all, melting into greyness. But she was, in spite of the violence of her awakening, still very, very sleepy. And so she lay there, dozing, until a flare of gas from the peat in the fireplace flooded the room and illuminated the portrait of handsome Dick once more above the fireplace. And then she realized that daylight had altogether faded and that she was alone in the dark. The panic that rose in her then was of the nature of nightmare, for she felt unable to move for terror, but it was worse than nightmare because she knew now that she was awake, and suddenly the full cause of her fear dawned on her, and she knew with a certainty of absolute conviction that she was about to see the terrible babies. She felt a sudden moisture break out on her face. Her tongue and throat went dry. All power of movement had slipped from her limbs, and she stared with wide eyes into the blackness which encompassed her. Then on the wall opposite, facing the windows, There grew a faint light of dusky crimson. For a moment she thought that it but heralded the approach of the awful vision, but then hope revived in her heart as she remembered the thick clouds of the afternoon and guessed that this light came from a sun not quite set. This sudden revival of hope gave her the necessary stimulus, and she sprang off the sofa where she lay. She looked out of the window and saw the dull glow on the horizon, but before she could take another step forward, it was obscured again. A tiny sparkle of a light came from the hearth, and the falling snow tapped heavily at the window panes. Except for these, there was no light and no other sound. Panic-stricken, Madge began to feel her way down the gallery. She stumbled against a chair, and then another, then a table barred her way, and turning swiftly aside, she found herself up against the back of the sofa. How had she ended up back there again? Once more she turned, and she saw the dim gleam of the firelight on the side of the room opposite to that on which she'd expected it. In a blind groping, she must have reversed her direction, but which way was she to go now? She seemed to be entirely hemmed in by furniture, and all the time she was harried by the imminent certainty that those two terrible, deadly ghosts were about to make their appearance. And then she began to pray. "Lighten our darkness, Lord," she said to herself. "Lighten our darkness," but she couldn't remember how the rest of the prayer went on. Something about the perils of the night. And now the fire glimmer, which should have been on her left, was on her right again. What was happening? "Oh, Lord, lighten our darkness," she whispered again, turning herself around, and again, "Lighten our darkness, Lord, lighten our darkness." She stumbled up against a screen, and she couldn't remember a screen ever having been in the room. Hastily, she felt blindly beside it and touched something soft and velvety. Was it the sofa? If so, where was its head? It had a head and a back and feet. It was like a person, all covered with grey lichen. And then Madge lost her head completely. She heard her own voice rising from whisper to speech and from speech to scream, and she shrieked out the holy words, "Lighten our darkness, oh Lord, lighten our darkness." She yelled them as if blaspheming, as she groped among tables and chairs and all the pleasant things of everyday life which had come so terrible. And then came a sudden and awful answer to her prayer. Another pocket of gas in the peat was reached by the smouldering embers, and the room started into light. She saw the evil eyes of handsome Dick. She saw the little ghostly snowflakes falling against the window. And she saw that the door in the middle of the room, through which the terrible babies regularly made their entrance, was opening. "Oh no, please no, please, in the name of all that it..." But yes, there, in the now open doorway, were two little figures, standing side by side. Slowly, they came towards her, shuffling in their white garments, toddling. She could see neither face or form distinctly, but she knew that these were the ghosts of terror, innocent of the awful doom that they were to bring, as she herself was innocent. With inconceivable rapidity of thought, Madge made up her mind what to do. Now, she had not hurt them or laughed at them, and they were but babies when the wicked and bloody deed had sent them to their burning death. Surely the spirits of children would not be inaccessible to the cry of one who was of the same blood as they, who had committed no fault that merited the doom that they brought. But it was but for the space of a moment that Madge hesitated, and then she sank down on her knees and stretched out her hands towards them. "Oh, my darlings," she said, "I only fell asleep. I have done no more wrong than that." She paused for a moment, and then her heart thought no more of herself, but only of them, those innocent spirits on whom so awful a doom was laid, that they should bring death where other children bring laughter, and doom for delight. And then, as the enlightenment of pity dawned on her, her fear fell away. "Oh, my poor dears," she said, "I'm sorry for you. It is not your fault that you must bring me what you must bring. But I'm not afraid any longer. God bless you. God bless you both, you poor children." And she raised her head and looked at them. Though it was so dark and dim and wavering, she could see their faces. They were like the light of pale flames shaken by a draught, but the faces were not miserable or fierce. Instead, they smiled at her with shy little baby smiles. And as she looked, they grew faint, fading slowly away like wreaths of vapor in frosty air. Well, Madge did not at once move when they had vanished, for instead of fear that was wrapped around her now, a wonderful sense of peace, a feeling so happy and serene that she would not willingly stir to disturb it. Before long, however, she got up, and feeling her way, she went out of the long gallery to find Blanche just coming upstairs, whistling and swinging her skates. "How's the leg, dear?" she asked. You're not limping any more." Till that moment, Madge had not thought of it. "Oh, I think it must be all right," she said. I'd forgotten it anyway. But now, Blanche, dear, you won't be frightened for me, will you? But I've seen the twins." "What?" "Yeah, I saw them just now, but they were kind, Blanche. They smiled at me, and I was so sorry for them. And somehow, well, I don't know, but I'm sure that I've nothing to fear." And it seems that Madge was right, for nothing untoward has come to touch her since that day. Something, her attitude to them, we must suppose, her pity, her sympathy, touched and dissolved and annihilated the curse. In fact, I was at Church Peveril myself only last week. I arrived there after dark, and I was passing the door of the long gallery, and I was rather surprised to see Blanche Peveril coming out, smiling broadly. "Ah, there you are," she said. Sorry I wasn't here to let you in. I've just been playing with the twins. They're such a cheeky little pair, so full of jokes. I stopped for nearly 10 minutes. But come on now, let's have tea downstairs. You must tell me all your news."